Chapter 11 examines the Kantian perspective on ethics, particularly its focus on fairness, justice, rationality, and moral duty. Unlike consequentialist theories that judge actions by their outcomes, Kantian ethics evaluates morality based on principles, intentions, and whether actions can be justified consistently for everyone. Throughout this presentation, we'll explore Kant's principle of universalizability, the relationship between morality and rationality, the idea of categorical imperatives, and some of the major strengths and criticisms of Kantian ethics. To understand Kant's moral framework, consider the example of a tax cheat. Imagine someone who avoids paying taxes in order to buy nice things for his family. He is never caught, no one is inspired to imitate him, and no one noticeably suffers from the small loss of tax revenue. From a purely consequence-based perspective, it may seem difficult to explain why this action is immoral if no harm results. Kant, however, would argue that morality is not determined by outcomes alone. Instead, morality depends on whether the action itself is fair, consistent, and capable of being justified as a universal rule. This example motivates Kant's deeper concern with fairness and moral consistency. For Kant, immoral acts essentially involve making exceptions of oneself. Moral consistency requires that we treat similar cases similarly. In other words, we cannot fairly claim special privileges for ourselves that we would deny to others. Two common moral tests reflect this idea. The first asks, what if everyone did that? The second asks, how would you like it if I did that to you? These tests are useful because they often expose unfairness, selfishness, and rule-breaking. However, Kant believed these informal tests were not always reliable enough. So, he developed a more systematic principle, known as universalizability. The principle of universalizability states that an act is morally acceptable only if its maxim is universalizable. This principle replaces the earlier moral tests with a single, more precise standard. The key question becomes, could the principle behind my action become everyone's principle without undermining the goal of the action itself? In other words, if everyone acted on the same maxim, would the action still make sense, or would the practice collapse? This idea leads directly into Kant's universalizability test. Kant's principle of universalizability, or PU test, involves several steps. First, clearly formulate your maxim by stating what you intend to do and why you intend to do it. Next, imagine a world in which everyone supports and acts on that same maxim. Then ask yourself, could the goal of my action still be achieved in such a world? If the answer is yes, then the maxim passes the principle of universalizability. If the answer is no, then the maxim is morally unacceptable because it creates a contradiction. The purpose of the test is to reveal whether someone is unfairly making an exception for themselves. To fully understand Kant's theory, we need to understand what a maxim is. A maxim is the principle or reason that explains why someone acts. For example, a person might lie in order to escape gambling debts or gain money. Kant emphasizes that morality depends on the intention behind an action rather than its results. This means two outwardly identical actions can differ morally depending on the maxims behind them. For Kant, the moral worth of an action comes from acting on principles that can be universalized consistently. Kant also believed there was a deep connection between morality and rationality. His argument for the irrationality of immorality proceeds step by step. If you are rational, then you are consistent. If you are consistent, then you obey the principle of universalizability. If you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally. Therefore, if you are rational, you are moral. And if you are immoral, you are irrational. The argument is logically valid, but Kant's critics question whether it is actually sound. This criticism introduces the challenge of amorality. The amoralists' challenge questions whether immoral people are truly irrational. According to this view, people only have reason to do something if it helps them achieve what they personally care about. However, doing one's moral duty does not always help people achieve their goals or desires. Therefore, people may sometimes lack any reason to act morally. If that is true, then violating moral duty could actually be perfectly rational in certain situations. This creates a major challenge for Kant because it separates rational self-interest from moral obligation. Although Kant's principle is insightful, Critics argue that it is not foolproof. Some individuals, including fanatics or deeply committed immoral actors such as Nazis, may consistently universalize their own harmful principles. In other words, not every universalizable maxim is necessarily moral. Because of this, critics argue that Kant's test does not reliably identify all cases of moral behavior. This criticism suggests that consistency alone may not be enough to guarantee morality. This discussion naturally connects to the idea of integrity. Integrity is the commitment to act according to one's principles, and Kant views integrity as an important moral virtue. However, integrity alone is not automatically admirable. A fanatic who consistently follows evil principles may still possess integrity. For this reason, integrity only has moral value when it is connected to legitimate moral principles. This raises an important question. Should morality depend only on consistency, or must the principles themselves also be morally good? Kant believed that some duties are absolute, meaning they must never be violated under any circumstances. One of these duties is the prohibition against lying. In the famous inquiring murderer case, Kant argued that a person must not lie even to save an innocent life. Critics argue that Kant misapplied his own theory here by ignoring context and alternative formulations of the maxim. According to Kant's framework, morality depends on the maxim behind the action. This raises the question, could the maxim involved in lying to save a life actually be universalizable? Many philosophers argue that it is extremely difficult to prove that any action is always wrong, regardless of every possible context and maxim. Kant distinguished between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives apply only if we have a particular goal. For example, if you want good grades, then you should study. The duty depends on the goal. Categorical imperatives are different because they apply to us regardless of our goals or desires. They command absolutely. Kant believed morality consists entirely of categorical imperatives because moral duties must apply universally to all rational beings. According to Kant, there is only one true categorical imperative, although it can be expressed in different formulations. One formulation of the categorical imperative states, act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. This formulation captures the idea that immoral behavior occurs when someone makes an exception for themselves. The classic example is the lying promise. If everyone made false promises whenever convenient, trust and promise itself would collapse. Because the practice would undermine itself if universalized, the maxim fails the categorical imperative test. Another important formulation of the categorical imperative focuses on ends and means. Kant states that we must always treat humanity, whether in ourselves or others, as an end and never merely as a means. Rational beings possess intrinsic value because rational nature is a precondition for enjoying many other benefits. Many things are valuable only because they benefit rational beings. But rational beings themselves are not simply tools for achieving someone else's goals. This idea forms the basis for Kant's emphasis on human dignity, autonomy, and respect for persons. To conclude, these questions encourage deeper reflection on Kantian ethics. What exactly is a maxim, and why does universalizability matter? Why do fanatics create problems for Kant's theory? Can morality truly be grounded in rationality alone? And why did Kant believe that morality must consist of categorical rather than hypothetical imperatives? These questions continue to shape modern discussions about ethics, justice, fairness, and moral responsibility.